Iceland is one of the strangest countries on Earth. It has glaciers larger than entire cities, volcanoes that can shut down air travel across Europe, some of the cleanest air on the planet, and landscapes that look almost untouched by humans. Yet there's one thing that's surprisingly difficult to find: trees. Fly across almost the entire country, and you'll see lava fields, mountains, moss, rivers, snow, but almost no forests. Because just across the North Atlantic, Norway, Sweden, and Finland are covered by millions of hectares of woodland. So why is Iceland so different? Was it always this barren? Or did an entire forest simply disappear? The answer is a story of Vikings, sheep, volcanoes, and one of the greatest environmental disasters that most people have never heard of. Today, forests cover only about 2% of Iceland. It's one of the least forested countries in Europe. Because of that, many people assume Iceland has always looked this way. But that's not true. More than 1,100 years ago, long before tourists arrived to photograph waterfalls and northern lights, the island looked completely different. When Norse settlers first landed around the late 9th century, they found valleys covered with hardy birch forests. Scientists estimate that between a quarter and nearly half of Iceland was once forested. The trees weren't massive redwoods or towering pines. Most were downy birch, small, twisted, built to survive cold winds and volcanic winters. But together, they formed a living shield that protected the island. Their roots held the loose volcanic soil together. Their branches slowed the wind. Their leaves trapped moisture. The forests weren't just part of the landscape. They were protecting the entire ecosystem. Unfortunately, the new settlers saw something else. They saw unlimited resources. And that assumption would change Iceland forever. The Vikings weren't trying to destroy nature. They were simply trying to survive. Everything required wood: homes, fishing boats, tools, furniture, cooking fires, winter heating. Every new settlement demanded more timber. Trees that had taken decades to grow could disappear in a single afternoon. But surprisingly, logging wasn't the biggest problem. The real turning point walked on 4 legs: sheep, thousands of them. To the Vikings, sheep were incredibly valuable. They provided meat, milk, wool, and economic security. But every spring, young birch saplings began pushing through the soil. Before they could grow, the sheep ate them. Again, and again, and again. The old trees continued dying naturally, but almost no young trees survived long enough to replace them. It was like removing every child from a city. The adults would remain for a while, but eventually, the entire population would disappear. And that's exactly what happened to Iceland forests. Losing the trees created a second problem, one that was even harder to reverse. Most people hear the words volcanic soil and think of fertile farmland. In Iceland, the reality is very different. Much of the island is covered by young volcanic ash. It's light, loose, and easily moved by wind. Think of the forests as thousands of natural anchors. Every root helped lock the ground in place. Remove the trees, and those anchors disappear. Powerful Arctic winds carried away the fertile topsoil. Heavy rain washed more into rivers and the sea. Year after year, the island literally lost the ground needed to grow new forests. Without soil, seeds had almost nowhere to take root. The landscape entered a vicious cycle. Fewer trees meant more erosion. More erosion meant even fewer trees. and escaping that cycle became almost impossible. In many parts of the world, forests eventually grow back on their own. Cut them down, wait long enough, and nature slowly repairs the damage. Iceland doesn't work that way. The growing season is incredibly short. Temperatures remain low for much of the year. Strong winds constantly batter young trees. Then there are the volcanoes. Fresh ash can blanket huge areas overnight. Some eruptions destroy vegetation completely. Even when conditions are perfect, a birch tree may need decades before producing enough seeds to expand the forest. Nature wasn't refusing to heal, it was simply moving far too slowly. By the early 20th century, less than 1% of Iceland's original forests remained. More than 1,000 years of decline had almost erased an ecosystem. But perhaps the biggest surprise was still to come. Most countries without forests face serious energy problems. Iceland did something different. Instead of looking above the ground, it looked below it. The island sits on one of the most active volcanic regions on Earth. Beneath its surface, heat is constantly rising. That geothermal energy became Iceland's greatest advantage. Today, hot underground water heats homes, generates electricity, warms greenhouses, and even melts snow from sidewalks in some towns. Ironically, one of the world's least forested countries became one of the world's leaders in renewable energy. Not because it planned to, but because it had little choice. Sometimes, nature takes something away, only to reveal a completely different opportunity. Today, the forests are slowly returning, very slowly. For more than a century, Iceland has invested heavily in restoring its landscape. Millions of trees have been planted. Native birch forests are expanding once again. Sheep are kept away from newly restored areas. Satellite images already show patches of woodland growing larger every decade. But this isn't a project that ends in 5 years, or even 50. Some forests planted today won't reach maturity until our grandchildren are old. That's how long it takes to repair damage that happened more than 1,000 years ago. Nature remembers, even when humans don't. So, why does Iceland have so few trees? Not because trees couldn't survive there, they already did, for thousands of years. The forests disappeared because of countless small decisions. One tree cut down, one more sheep released, one more season of erosion. None of those choices seemed catastrophic on their own, but together, they transformed an entire country. Today, when people look at Iceland's vast open landscapes, they often see untouched wilderness. In reality, they're looking at the scars of history. The remarkable part isn't that Iceland lost its forests. It's that after more than 1,000 years, the country is still patiently trying to bring them back, one tree at a time. And perhaps that's the biggest lesson Iceland has to offer. The hardest part of destroying nature isn't the destruction itself. It's discovering just how long it takes to rebuild what was once taken for granted.